Well, you know what that means. Samgele Masego is standing by with this week's installment of Explain and Verify. So, you've seen, of course, a lot of claims about votes that were possibly not counted, lost, or maybe not being in the system or deleted. There's a lot, of course, to talk about. Let's now bring in Samgele Masego to give us a sense of how things are looking right here. So Samgele, the MK party has made its position very clear on this particular matter. They're not happy about the votes, but social media also being a buzz about this.
Indeed, Bongiwe, on Friday last week, we witnessed the swearing in of 342 members of the National Assembly, the election of the Speaker and the President. The country now has a democratically elected 7th President of this particular 7th administration, President Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa, President of the 7th administration. Tonight, we explain and verify some of the claims of his political detractors of UMkhonto WeSizwe, whose members were absent during the swearing in of both the National Assembly members and also the presidential inauguration of President Ramaphosa. Last Sunday, the party announced it will eventually take up its seats in parliament and be part of the Progressive Caucus. The party still insists there was gross election irregularities and vote rigging. The party claims millions of its votes were unaccounted for. Let's listen to the MK spokesperson, Nhlamulo Ndlela, speaking on behalf of former President Jacob Zuma, who leads the party on this particular claim of their 9 misaccounted votes.
For the record, UMkhonto WeSizwe is of the strong view that the 2024 elections were rigged and that the results announced by the IEC are not a true reflection of the will of the people. We have instructed our legal team to take any steps possible both inside of South Africa and internationally to ensure that justice is done. We cannot allow a situation where millions of votes have been stolen. The legal team will report on the possible avenues which are available.
UMkhonto WeSizwe claims that there were 9.3 million votes that could not be reconciled, and with the actual voting figures that were there, the party says it could only point to election rigging and massive attempt to subvert the democratic will of the citizens of this particular country. And that, Bongiwe, goes to this particular first slide. 9.3 million votes that we need to explain the MK party claims went missing. The IEC refutes this particular election. We will explain and verify later why. But at this point in time, MK party says 9.3 million of its votes went missing, burnt, unaccounted for, nowhere to be found. Let's just listen to what the IEC CEO had to say on this particular matter.
The results that were announced on the 2nd of June and the seats that were assigned on the 2nd of June have not changed. What has happened in the intervening period is that for purposes of clarity, we have changed the manner in which we project the public-facing results to make it simpler for people who want to access the results. What do we mean by that? We've combined the votes cast for a party on a regional ballot, as well as the votes cast for that party on a national compensatory ballot, and added them together.
Bongiwe, that is essentially the IEC saying that and explaining this issue of this 9.3 million votes and explaining how the votes were ultimately calculated within this particular election. If we just go to our next slide, it explains how this election was held on the 29th of May, where the allocation of the National Assembly seats, where you were given a ballot paper. For instance, if you look at point 1, each voter had 2 ballots for the National Assembly. So for the National Assembly, you had 2 ballot papers where you had to cast your votes. And those 2 ballot papers are ultimately the one that determine the number of seats within the National Assembly and also the province to national seats, which are ultimately calculated. You've got 200 seats for the National Assembly, 200 seats for the regional ballot. And it also speaks to the national compensatory ballot, which was also there. And it also then comes to the regional national ballot, which is ultimately what has become a bone of contention at this point in time, where the IEC dashboard was a buzz over the past weekend, with many South Africans saying that how come the ANC numbers have jumped to over 12.8 million South Africans who voted for the ANC, when the voter turnout in this particular election was 16.2 million South Africans who actually went out to vote for their political formations. Bongiwe.
And Samkela, of course, it all adds to, a bit of maybe education of how counting possibly would have been done. Maybe something needed to be done to educate a lot more South Africans about how this is all going to work, because the issue of the 3 ballots was the big one here. And you think about, right now, what does it all mean then in terms of how it's all done when looking at the composition of the National Assembly, for example?
Let's move into the next particular slide, and which explains how the National Assembly allocations truly transpired within this particular election. In the National Assembly, you've got 400 seats of members of the National Assembly. Then you go down to the 200 regional seats, which ultimately culminate within this regional ballot that was added in this particular election. And then you've got the 200 national seats. For instance, let me use the ANC as an example. The ANC has a national to national list and a province to national list. And the province to national list ultimately falls into the category of the regional ballot paper. And the national to national list, which was cutting off at 73 on that particular list that they had, which Parkstar, which is falling off at 74. That particular list is the directly elected members of the National Assembly on the 200 that all political formations contest for. The ANC had 73 on that particular national to national, and the Democratic Alliance then had their own. And then when it comes to the regional one, which ultimately then moves Bongiwe to explaining the culmination of the seats in the KwaZulu-Natal provincial legislature, and also the confusion as to why the NFP is not represented in the National Assembly when people are conflating the regional ballot paper and also the national ballot paper. And that speaks to Bongiwe, the claims of the National Freedom Party did not get a seat in the provincial legislature of KwaZulu-Natal, and that the IEC awarded the party a seat in voting irregularities. The NFP did not get any seat on the National Assembly on both national ballot papers. It is likely that the KZN regional national ballot is mistaken for the provincial legislative ballot, which now moves to point 4 on the allocation on our next slide of the seats in the KwaZulu-Natal provincial legislature, where the MK party, Bongiwe, because they got the largest chunk of votes in the province, where over 3.1 million residents of KwaZulu-Natal voted. The MK party got just over 1.6, 1.8 million of the votes within that particular province, which put them at 37 seats within the provincial legislature. Then you move to the Inkatha Freedom Party, the second biggest party in the province of KwaZulu-Natal electorally at this point in time, which got 15 seats in the provincial legislature. The ANC, third biggest political formation in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, dropping from 54% to that mere 17% that they got in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. And the Democratic Alliance coming in as the fourth biggest party with 11 seats in the legislature. The Economic Freedom Fighters, they were the most wounded alongside the ANC within this particular election, dropping from 6 members of the provincial legislature to 2 members of the provincial legislature. Then the kingmaker, the NFP, which ultimately culminate in the 80 seats in the provincial legislature of KwaZulu-Natal. And once you saw in the voting patterns of the premiership between Nkosi Chiliza and also Premier Tamintuli, the government of provincial unity was able to amass 41 votes. And I don't want to call them the progressive bloc, but the proposed progressive bloc of the MK and the EFF only garnered 39 votes in the legislature, where you saw Mervyn Dix losing against Nontombeko Boyce for the position of a Speaker of the Provincial Legislature. Ultimately, when they had to vote for Premier, the government of Provincial Unity then lost one vote on the virtue of the vote for the Speaker who no longer could vote. Bongiwe.
It's quite interesting, Samgele, that you talk about all of this amidst this speculation around who is going to be in cabinet, because some are saying that what we're seeing at provincial level could also play out at national level as well.
At national level, it's a battle of clauses. Clauses 24, clauses of sufficient consensus, where there's no sufficient consensus, on the sufficient consensus itself, where the DA says we're not consulted, on the inclusion of the Patriotic Alliance, whom are largely making strong inroads against the Democratic Alliance in the Western Cape, particularly on that coloured vote. Then you've got racial slurs of Democratic Alliance members of Parliament now, whom have made racist remarks, which the DA fails to call racism when it is pure racism at that point in time, when Balintuli was charged for basically liking a particular post, when Ngababanga was essentially removed from the Democratic Alliance on issues along racial lines. And that wonders what the President of the Republic, Cyril Ramaphosa, will have to ponder within the next 2 days as he has to appoint his national executive. Will there be sufficient consensus? When there's no sufficient consensus on the consensus itself within this government of national unity, is it a government of national unity, or is it just a grand coalition of many political formations? Next week, Monday, you will know your executive, and we will definitely look at those particular individuals. Will John Hazen be the minister in the presidency? Will Gwede Mantashe be retained at Mineral Resources as is being blamed for the poor performance of the economy? Will Sputla Ramokgopa remain at the Minister of Electricity? One wonders what the president will announce either on Saturday or Sunday. I didn't say those days.